Last year, around this time, I attended a luncheon on the South Shore held by the South Shore Chamber of Commerce. And they had hired Market Street Services out of Atlanta, Georgia, to help them better understand their position in the market for economic development opportunities. And the principal of Market Street Services talked about housing as part of the infrastructure that was needed. And I was really taken by his approach, by his, his examples. And so we asked someone from Market Street to come and speak to us today. So Matt Tarleton is Vice President and Principal at Market Street Services. He does both direct project management, working with communities both large and small, mostly in the South. And he's also their Director of Research and Data Services. I think it's a good moment for us to kind of hear what's happening in the rest of the country because, like we talked about yesterday, we do not exist on an island. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Matt Tarleton.
Market Street Services, let me give you a little bit of background on who we are and the work that we do so that I'll give you some context for my remarks today. We were founded in 1997 by Mac Holliday. Mac is the gentleman that Susan was speaking about. Mac is a former state-level economic development director in Mississippi, South Carolina, and the state of Georgia. Founded Market Street in 1997 after working with a lot of communities in the Southeast, predominantly in his work at the state level. And seeing that in the 70s and the 80s, they were not really receiving the kind of advice that he felt they needed to be healthy communities, to be competitive places. In the 70s and the 80s, the South was basically just turning to places like Massachusetts and Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Michigan and saying, we've got low taxes, we got cheap labor, come on down. And he saw communities neglecting their public schools, neglecting issues like housing, and neglecting just fundamental aspects of community well-being. And so he wanted to start a firm that would help communities across the country think about economic development in a more holistic way, to consider that people are our most important asset. Okay? Companies, we talk about companies a lot and recruiting companies and that's economic development, but at the end of the day, it always comes back to people. And so that is really what's reflected in that last bullet point here, that our approach to all the work that we do around the country is really predicated on one thing, and that is that economic development is about making people's lives better. Again, we talk a lot about job creation, but what's the point of creating a job, right? You create a job so people have income. Incomes make their lives better. They can provide things for their families. We forget that a lot. We go to ribbon cuttings, we look at headlines in the newspaper, we laud, oh, we got a 200 job announcement, 250 job announcement, but we don't think about the end game. And so that is, at the end of the day, the end game. We are facilitators. We help communities think through their problems, the challenges that they're facing, and with stakeholders like yourselves, develop a strategy to address them. We really take a holistic view of community, economic, and workforce improvement. We aren't subject matter experts in any one area. We have to have broad knowledge of a variety of issues, and we rely on individuals like yourself to help us understand the real difficulties of specific issues, be that housing or be that entrepreneurship or be that public education in the community. And so we work in communities large and small. One day, as I told Susan, I'll be in Watertown, South Dakota, population 22,000. That's the 4th largest city in South Dakota. The next day, I'll be in Nashville. You're working in Watertown on issues of aesthetics, community pride. The next day, you're in a place like Nashville talking about entrepreneurship, how we can attract health IT jobs and so forth. So the work takes us many, many different places and addressing many different things. Today I want to talk a little bit about some things that we're seeing that are really shaping conversations in community, economic, and workforce development today, specifically some key demographic trends. And I want to talk a little bit about not just how those are shaping the conversations in community and economic development, but hopefully give you all some thought-provoking information that will help you think about how these things affect housing and affordability. I do not have a silver bullet for affordable housing provision in Massachusetts. I don't think any of you do either, but I can tell you this. A lot of the country looks to what you all have done because the rest of the country doesn't face a lot of the same constraints that you all face here. I know that you all may feel like you are in a precarious position, and you certainly are. The rest of the country is in many respects far behind you all in terms of thinking about this issue. So I want you to keep that in mind as we talk through some of these things. And hopefully, while I don't have that silver bullet, I do hope that some of this information will give you some more ammunition, if you will, in making your case for affordable housing in your communities. Greg Gipp is a writer for the Wall Street Journal. In 2015, had some great insights really that spoke to this issue that we're going to speak about today. Ever since the global financial crisis, economists have groped for reasons to explain why growth in the U.S. and abroad has repeatedly disappointed. They're now coming to realize that one of the stiffest headwinds is also one of the hardest to overcome: demographics. What is Greg talking about? Well, very simply, he's talking about the retirement of the baby boom generation, and he's talking about the pressure that that's going to place on communities around the country. Nationwide, what you're looking at here is census data on population by age. Okay? Down at the bottom, you see those under the age of 20. Let me find my laser pointer here. Your blue bar right here in the middle, these are your 25 to 44-year-olds. Yes, that does not perfectly align with our millennial generation that we talk so much about, but that 20-year cohort is really important because they are the folks that are going to be replacing those that are age 45 to 64, that are going to be exiting the workforce or considering exiting the workforce in the next 10 years. Okay, that is the pipeline that is going to be replacing those workers over the course of the next decade. What you see there is that nationwide we have an almost identical size cohort, age 25 to 44, as those 45 to 64. So that means that nationwide we have just enough people age 25 to 44 to replace those 45 to 64 that are going to be exiting the workforce. Right? A few years ago, if we looked at this, it was actually identical, 26.2%. Now, anything short of that, 25 to 44-year-olds less than that 45 to 64 cohort, and we've got concerns about the sustainability of our workforce. Just a raw numbers issue. Do we have enough people to replace those that are going to be exiting the workforce? Now, nationwide, we overcome this for one simple reason, okay, this potential shortage: international immigration, right? Lots of people want to come to the United States for opportunity. The same way we overcome this nationwide, through immigration, communities can overcome disadvantageous age composition by attracting more people to their community than they lose, right? Does that make sense? We might have disadvantageous age composition, but if we can attract more than those that are leaving our community on an annual basis, that will improve over time. So how do things look in the Commonwealth? Not quite as good. Look at your 25 to 44 cohort, 26.2% as compared to 27.8% age 45 to 64. So, just on a pure numbers level, if we are not attracting more people to the Commonwealth than we are losing on an annual basis, our workforce will necessarily shrink. There will not be enough people to replace those retiring baby boomers over the course of the next 10 years. Now let's take a look at some of the subregions, Boston MSA counties. This is just looking at those in the Commonwealth: Essex, Middlesex, Norfolk, Plymouth, and Suffolk. Okay, you see the opposite here. Slightly larger cohort, more sustainable workforce, right? That's kind of what we might expect based on the narrative today about workforces concentrating in cities and so forth. I got one more bar to show you. This is where we cue the alarms and the sirens, folks. This is all other Massachusetts counties. 25 to 44 cohort represents 23.6% of the population. Those 45 to 64 represent 28.8%, more than a 5 percentage point gap. It's one of the largest I've seen in any of my time working at Market Street in 10 years. That is a serious, serious gap, folks. Now remember what I said. We can overcome this through migration. Let's look at some individual counties, though. Now, I apologize for everybody in the back. I see a lot of you have glasses on, so that's great. You'll get a printout of this or an email of this later so you can take a look closely. But what you see on the far left of this graph are the least sustainable workforces. What you see on the far right are the most sustainable workforces. Now, of course, what this ignores is we're looking at this at a county level, okay? And jurisdictional, or whether they're municipal or county boundaries, are not our best reflections of what our true workforce is, or our true labor shed, right? Labor sheds are generally regional, but nonetheless, it is still an interesting look. Far left, those that have the large 45 to 64 cohort, those on the far right, those with the large 25 to 44 cohort. You see some things like Hampshire County there in the middle, the 5 colleges, the strength there, the big college population. But what you see is, certainly, yes, we know Barnstable and places that we feel we know have been retirement destinations show up, but some of these other communities and counties that are not places you might typically think of as a retirement community certainly are starting to resemble them. And over the course of the next 10 years, will absolutely start to resemble them even more so if we don't change the migration picture. So, what I'm about to show you is a time series looking at how the Commonwealth has attracted and retained talent over the course of the last couple decades. Now, this data comes from the IRS. Surprise, surprise, the IRS knows a lot about you. One thing they know about you is they know when you filed a tax return in a county in 2014 and you filed a tax return in a different county, or claimed that county the next year, you probably moved between those two counties. Okay, we count the number of returns that moved between counties as a good estimate of household movement, and we look at the number of exemptions as a good estimate of the number of people. Okay, so what I'm about to show you is that IRS data that looks at the difference between the number of exemptions flowing into the Commonwealth and the number of exemptions flowing out of the Commonwealth each year. And they were all supposed to come in nicely over time. I was going to tell this beautiful story over 30 seconds, but of course the animation didn't work for me. So, the big reveal all at once. You see the 1990s, very severe. Roughly 40,000 more people moving out of the Commonwealth each year than those moving in. The tech bubble. We started to do a lot better, right? Started to hold on to a lot more people, started to attract a lot more people from outside the country. But nonetheless, we're still a net loser. That picked up. The tech bubble burst, right? Then what happened? 2005, 2006. If you look at this data, you might say, well, that's a little early for that recession impact. Anybody remember what happened in the country in 2005? Okay. That tells me a lot about my audience. Yes, you're right. What else happened in 2005? Katrina and Rita. Hundreds of thousands of people relocated from the Gulf Coast to all over the country. And there were huge impacts, and that's what you see in 2005 and 2006. Then in 2007, the Great Recession hit. Mobility stopped. People stopped moving. Those places that were large net attractors started to see that net attraction decline. Those people that were net losers saw their net loss decline. Okay, so we all approached zero during the recession. People could not move. They were underwater in their mortgages. Any number of factors, lack of jobs, it depressed mobility. And so places that were net losers like the Commonwealth benefited in this regard from the Great Recession. It is a very strange thing. But we see as we emerge, those trends are starting to turn again, back to the negative. Now, this is one very important piece of data from the IRS. The Census Bureau also collects data on migration. And the Census Bureau tells a bit rosier picture. And without going into the methodological details, suffice it to say that the trends are generally consistent. And the takeaway is this. If we don't change these trends, our workforce is necessarily going to shrink here. Okay? That is the backdrop for everything that we're talking about. Now, the one other bit I'll share at this is almost entirely driven by domestic outmigration, by people moving from the Commonwealth to other parts of the country. You all are one of the leaders in the country in terms of rates of international net in-migration. Okay, do a fantastic job attracting international migrants. It's the folks that were born here that are choosing to move elsewhere for myriad reasons, of which you all know. One is certainly the affordability of housing. This is something that I wish I could go through for another 50 minutes or so with each of your communities, because this is easily the most fascinating data, in my opinion. If you want one indicator of the health of your community, go look at the net migration figures from the IRS. It is truly, it reflects the revealed preferences of people. Do they want to be in your place or not? Are there opportunities for them or not? Can they stay or do they have to go elsewhere? It reveals everything. It captures all else. So I would absolutely encourage you all to go back, take a look at this data. It's easily accessible. Google IRS migration stats. You can see the counties that they're moving to, the counties where people are moving into. It's really, really fascinating data. So thank you for humoring me as I delved into that nerd zone for just a minute. Now, we're going to combine these two things that we looked at to look at net migration and age composition. And you've got a plot here. We're going to start to see a bunch of dots pop up reflecting the states. Okay? Your top right quadrant here is those states that have positive rates of net in-migration and also have a favorable age composition. So your left-hand axis here is looking at the gap, percentage point gap between the 25 to 44 population and the 45 to 64, right? So in the Commonwealth, we'd see that basically -1 gap. Okay, so we already revealed one thing there. And then on the net migration side, this is the level of net immigration from 2000 to 2014 as a share of 2000 population. Okay, so those net attractors are going to be positive, losers negative. The red dot there is Massachusetts. This quadrant represents your winners. These are the states that are effectively very well positioned for job growth over the course of the next decade. They have highly sustainable workforces. From an age standpoint, they're attracting people at high rates. These are some folks that you might not expect. Nevada, Arizona, Idaho, Pacific Northwest comes up a lot, Oregon, Washington, Oklahoma, Utah, and then your usual suspects, Georgia and Texas. Your losers, down in this quadrant, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Vermont, Indiana, Maryland, Minnesota, Iowa, Connecticut, Ohio. You get the geographic theme? And then you got Mississippi thrown in there. I'm from Georgia. Don't get me started on Mississippi. The other piece to this puzzle that we haven't really talked about, and I'm not going to go into great detail today, is talent development. Okay? We talk about three things in terms of workforce sustainability. Our ability to attract and retain talent, reflected by net migration, our current workforce demographics, our age composition, and then the other piece is talent development. Do we have institutions that are regularly producing a pipeline of workers, and are they producing the right pipeline? Are they producing the degrees and the skill sets that our employers need? Okay, and that is an important piece of the puzzle. Why am I not going to go into great detail about it today? Because higher education institutions from a workforce standpoint are only an advantage to your communities and to a state to the degree to which you can retain them, right? Otherwise, you're just degree factories. You're pumping out graduates. They're going to other places like Atlanta. Keep them coming. We love your graduates. We're trying desperately to become the innovation hotbed that you are in Midtown Atlanta. So yes, again, only an advantage to the degree to which you can retain them. So let's look at how some of the net migration trends are playing out across the entire country. This is a map of the net migration trends from 2000 to 2011 taken from IRS data, okay, and plotted by county. This only goes up to 2011 because the IRS just released 3 years of data a few months ago, taking us up to 2014, and we just haven't updated this full county level analysis. But what you see is, well, first, a hollowing out of the interior of the country, the plain states. All the orange are net losers. Your purple are those that are gaining the most on a per capita level. Okay? What are those purple pockets? By and large, they are metropolitan areas. Okay? You see the bias towards the coast, the hollowing out of the interior. Now let's zoom in a little bit. This is a little unexpected for me, to be honest with you. Okay? This seems a little strange. We're seeing this very small amount of net outmigration in the Boston metro, and we're seeing basically zero, okay, this kind of level from 2000 to 2011. So it tells us something about what's happened from 11 to 14, that gap that we missed and the differences with this data. But what you also see is that the cities here are the net losers, or it looks like the metropolitan areas here are some of the net losers. Attracting young people, what's happening? Before they file a tax, they come to these places for their first job, right out of college, before they file the tax return. Okay? So then they file their first tax return here, they move to another job, and that's where you start to pick up the flow. Okay? Now let's zoom in on a slightly different part of the country. This is my home area. Metro Atlanta, right here. See this ring of purple? This tells the story of the traditional suburban expansion of the South, how our metropolitan areas grew in the Southeast over the course of the last couple decades as people fled the cities, moved to the suburbs, sought lower cost environments. Now, if we update this and look at 11 to 14, this map for Metro Atlanta is completely different. The interior, that is white and orange now, is purple. The exterior is just slightly less purple. We are still attracting a great number of people to the metro region, but the core is thriving. This is a nice little side anecdote for you. That little orange county in the middle of Metro Atlanta, where there was a huge net outmigration, that's what happens when your school system loses accreditation. The Clayton County school system was, I think, the first public school system in the country in a couple decades to actually lose accreditation from its accrediting body, and not surprisingly, families left rapidly. Okay. You all are very familiar with ULI. Urban Land Institute conducted a great survey that they've since updated a number of times. They keep getting deeper and deeper on certain issues like housing. Great report they released on housing last year in 2015. But this survey that they conducted asked folks about their preferred place to live. Okay? Now keep those maps in mind. Remember, we're talking about how people are starting to flock back into cities and how we think that those maps would change if we looked at 11 to 14 data. Survey asked, what's your ideal size for your preferred place of residence? And results were segmented by generation. So let's first look at the boomers. Okay? Your far left there in red is those that prefer rural environments. Your yellow, small town America, suburbs, medium or large cities, and other environments. Let's look at Gen X. Not much different, except we see a slightly larger preference for the suburbs. Okay, that's not terribly surprising if we just take for granted all the stereotypes that we have about folks in their certain age group and their desire to move out towards suburbs where there are more desirable and more homogeneous school districts. Unfortunately, that is the reality that we face around much of the country. And so this is very consistent with that. Now, Gen Y, your millennial generation, that's where we start to see the big differences. Okay? Suburban America does not get squeezed. That's where the misperception is. When people talk about millennials, they talk about millennials not wanting to be in suburbs, right? Isn't that what we always hear? Millennials hate suburbs. They want to go to cities where there's transit and density and amenities. They don't want to be in rural and small town America. They're okay with suburbs, but they really don't want to be in rural and small town America. And that has serious, serious implications. Now, a lot of folks are questioning, are these preferences going to change? Are millennials going to age into wanting to be back in these environments once they have kids? And are they going to look just like the rest of us once it's all said and done? Nobody really has the answer at this point. The early evidence shows that millennials are staying in cities. At least in a lot of the southeastern places we have started to study, the evidence in the school enrollment data shows that the young people that have moved into historically underperforming school districts in central cities in a lot of southeastern and midwestern communities are staying. They're keeping their kids in these school districts, and they're not leaving to go to what are perceived to be higher performing school districts in small towns or in suburbs. So we've talked about some of these things already. Why are millennials looking to these cities and more urban environments instead of rural and small town America? Well, there's a number of things that are pretty common. One thing I want to mention is a great study that the Knight Foundation did 3 years ago called The Soul of the Community. And Knight operates, I think, newspapers and media in 19 different markets, I believe. They surveyed over 40,000 people in those 19 markets and asked them what attached them to their community. The term they used was stickiness. What makes a community sticky and keeps people here? Okay, and the results were very surprising, but also very, very interesting. The top 3 things that attached people to a community were, number 1, social offerings. Okay, is there enough stuff to do to keep me happy? The second was openness and inclusion. How welcoming is this place to people of diverse backgrounds? The third was aesthetics. Does it look good, right? People need to have pride in the place that they call home. What wasn't on that list? Low cost, schools, okay? All these things, right? All these things that we thought might pop up on the list. What really attaches people are some of these other factors. And that's what's driving millennials into cities, amenities, but also that diversity, okay, that they feel they can find in urban environments that in many cases they feel they can't find in those suburban, small town, or rural environments. All of these things really come together in one thing, and that's the notion of creating an environment that provides access, okay, and choice. And it's that word we all hear many times, mixed use. Okay, it is something that here you have in much more abundance out of necessity, I would say, but in the Southeast and in the Midwest, where there is abundant land and fewer development regulations, we have very, very few true mixed-use walkable environments, and certainly not in small-town America. Okay, certainly not in suburban or small-town America. So how is all this playing out around the country? Now, I've alluded to some of these trends about folks moving back into central cities. Let's take a look at some of the evidence. This is looking at the core county or the central county in a metropolitan area and its share of population growth over the course of the last 15 years. And we're going to start with my home region of Metro Atlanta. This is showing you Fulton County's share of Metro Atlanta's population growth each year. Okay, so early in the 2000s, Fulton County was shedding population. Okay, net loser of population. That started to turn in the middle of the last century, or I'm sorry, in the middle of the last decade. Fulton County started to gain population. Okay, people started to move back into the city of Atlanta. And we saw that trend continue throughout the 2000s. Dallas, very similar trend. Okay, Dallas County. Denver, again, very similar. Indianapolis, Nashville, Philadelphia, and Seattle. I could put so many other metropolitan regions up here. There's so much evidence it's happening. okay? And it's happening in a very severe way. Now, for all of you that are not in a core county, in a metropolitan area, or what I'll say is, in Georgia we have, I've lost count, I don't even know, we have something like over 400 municipalities. I think it's 141 counties. I should know that. We keep incorporating a new place each day, and the county geography here may not be as relevant to Massachusetts. But think about, for those of you that are not a core city in a metropolitan region, what would this look like for the rest of your area? It's the inverse. That's the serious implication, right? So businesses are taking note of this. When I started this work at Market Street about 10 years ago, the conversations that I had with communities were by and large about what we would call the three legs of the economic development stool. Existing business support, existing business expansion, small business development and entrepreneurship, and corporate recruitment. Those were the three things that we talked about in economic development. Today, the conversation is about workforce, number one, and quality of place, number two. And those two things are so inextricably linked that we can't separate them. The conversations that we used to have about economic development here and workforce development here and community improvement here and housing over here, those siloed conversations aren't relevant anymore. And we're starting to see this in the processes that we're doing with chambers of commerce, with local governments, with economic development organizations, with public-private partnerships around the country. The conversations that we're having are more holistic, okay? And it's a good thing. Communities need to have this more holistic view of economic development. Businesses are recognizing, and the business communities in the communities that we're working in are recognizing that if they want to stay competitive, okay, if they want to continue to expand in a certain region, they've got to be able to get the workforce that they need, and they need to invest in the place that's going to attract it. So the business community is starting to get behind these things. The business community is starting to get behind investments in quality of place. And so as we look at their decision-making process, they're following these people now, okay? I'm going to show you a list of some corporate announcements of some movements from suburbs back into the city center. But I want to talk you through this site selection process very carefully. Many of you are probably familiar with this. As a company is going through and evaluating a region or evaluating the country really for a place to locate their business, they're looking for a wide variety of criteria. And it varies tremendously by sector, whatever line of business they're in. But essentially what we're doing is we're conducting a national search. We're finding regions that fit the profile of what we need as a business. And then we're going into regions and we're finding an ideal site within it. Okay? These requirements, again, they vary considerably by sector, but there are some common themes. Area development has conducted a survey for many years looking at top site location factors. They survey corporate decision makers rather than the site selection consultants that often guide these decisions. The corporate decision makers having a closer feel to what really is a need for their business. And what you see at the top of this list from the 2014 survey is availability of skilled labor. Now what I didn't show, and if Google could find for me the 8th annual survey from area development, I would have had a slide for you. But what I can guarantee you is that availability of skilled labor was not at the top of the list. Taxes was the top of the list for decades, okay? Low cost, low cost, low cost. Low labor costs, we want it to be cheap, that's where we're gonna go, right? And that was the narrative that so many communities in the Northeast and the Midwest experienced. It happened, okay? But those days are over. The days of people leaving this part of the country and coming to the South for cost are done. There are limited examples of it, certainly. But the reason why some of these communities that are succeeding in economic development today are because of the skilled labor. From 2013 to 2016, This is just a brief list of companies that took note of what was happening with talent in their regions that they were operating in. The best example I can give you here is NCR. NCR relocated to Metro Atlanta in 2006 from just outside Cleveland. If you don't know NCR, they make all those, they make ATMs, they make all the little kiosks that when you go to the airport, you do your self-check-in. That's NCR. They relocated their corporate headquarters, about 3,000 employees from outside Cleveland to Metro Atlanta in 2006. Okay? 8 years later, in 2014, they relocated to Gwinnett County, which is about 10 miles north of the city of Atlanta. In 2014, they announced that they were moving 10 miles down the road to Midtown Atlanta to build a brand new corporate campus right next to Georgia Tech. Okay? They invested millions to move their entire workforce, their whole company, capital expenditures to Gwinnett County. And 7 years later, they said, sunk cost. We're moving 10 miles because they couldn't get the talent that they needed to go 10 miles up the road. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. 10 miles up the road in Atlanta is not 10 minutes. Okay? They went down there so that they could be present and visible to all of those smart people coming out of Georgia Tech, right? See NCR every day, and when they graduate, they can go to work there. Countless other examples of this, as you can see, around the country. So what have we learned? What's the recap here? Labor shortages are coming. Baby boomers are exiting the workforce. Regions with those disadvantageous age dynamics can overcome the shortages through positive levels of net in-migration. Millennials are preferring urban environments, and businesses are responding to the trends. Where does the Commonwealth stand? Well, disadvantageous age dynamics, net out-migration, some positive news on both fronts. Okay, but it's not an overall rosy picture. As we've said, if things don't change, the workforce here is necessarily going to shrink. In terms of quality of place, in terms of housing, what's the implication? It's clear. If you're not providing the environments, right, that attract the talent can't come. Okay? So we have to start. If our appeal is jobs and growth, we know that talent is the key to that, the number one driver of that today. And we also know from talking to millennials and talking to others about what they prefer in a place, that place matters. Okay? So we can draw the link directly. If our goal is job creation and economic development, economic sustainability and economic improvement, it starts with talent. And our talent attraction and retention efforts start with place. And housing is such a big, big piece of that. This little bit here at the bottom gives you a quick summary of kind of where things stand on some of these key indicators. Looking at the Commonwealth's share of jobs across the country is kind of our benchmark, okay? 2.5% of jobs located in the state. Job openings, 2.3%, okay? At present. What does that tell you? Job market, slightly not as strong as what you see nationwide. If you expect these all to track closely on that per capita or per employee level. Degree completions, 2.8%, a little higher than our job creation. So we think we are exporting a little bit of talent. Our 25 to 44-year-olds, only 2.1%. Another way of looking at this, okay? 2.5% of jobs, but only 2.1% of our nation's future experienced workforce. That bottom bullet is the real positive side that I mentioned earlier. We're really succeeding on our international migration figures. So, this is the question: do we have what it takes to compete in this environment? Now, we could spend all day going through and talking about each of these things and checking off and evaluating how we do in each of these areas. But they're all important, and the unfortunate answer is that you got to get them all right. that it's not an either or. The communities that are providing one great thing are not succeeding. The communities that are providing choices and are checking as many of these boxes as possible are winning. And those that are getting it wrong, and really wrong in one area, can really, really kill a community. It can kill the successes that you've had in all these other areas. Anybody been following what's been happening in North Carolina or Georgia or Indiana last year? Religious liberty, RFRA legislation, okay? We have countless companies that have stated their intentions and threatened to leave these communities and leave these states if they didn't repeal or reverse some of this legislation that was perceived to be discriminatory. I was telling Susan an anecdote. We're working in Lynchburg, Virginia right now, which is home to Liberty University. And Liberty is a fantastic institution and a great asset for that community. But their founder has made some very, very controversial statements that are not perceived to be inclusive. And as a result of those statements, Liberty was hosting the Commonwealth Debate Championships 3 weeks ago. And half of the debate teams, high school juniors and seniors who had spent their high school trying to achieve the pinnacle, reach the state debate championships, said, we're not going to the state debate championships that are hosted at Liberty University because of what Jerry Falwell Jr. had to say. Think about that for a second. You kind of got to shake them and say, you have to realize that it's unfortunate, but all the good work you've done on downtown improvement, on housing provision, okay, on trying to provide commuter rail to DC and all these things, it's all great, but it can all be undone by one thing, by being perceived to not be an inclusive community. The same is true for housing, and you all know that all too well, right? So the affordability picture. I'm going to try to pick up the pace here so we leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. This, I think, is going to be more familiar information to all of you. This is looking at an index of home prices and household incomes nationwide from 1980 up until 2014. An index essentially sets the value of home prices and incomes in that starting year to a value of 100. So it allows us to compare the change over time for two different indicators on the same graph. This is your index of median existing single-family home prices nationwide. All right, pretty steady increase. We see our housing bubble. We see our burst. Here's household incomes. Tracked decently, and we saw our deviation occur when the bubble started, and we see the crisis emerging again. What do we see in the Commonwealth? Let me go back. Because that intersection point right there, that's about 300, a little over 350% growth over the course of three plus decades. Where are you there? About 600%. Okay, where do you think the green line is? Right? This is one way of just combining the two. We take the ratio of median existing single-family home prices to median household incomes. Higher ratios are not good. High ratio is less affordable housing. And what we saw was if we had gone back farther in history, we would see these trend lines tracking around that ratio of 3 farther back in history. And we started to see this deviation. Well, what do you see in Massachusetts? Obviously, you see the 1980s housing bubble that was experienced here and not many other parts of the country with a lot of speculative buying. And you see that that's really where the affordability gap emerged and how it's persisted. Now, this is on the ownership side. Here's your rental picture. Okay, this is the same concept, an index starting at 100 this is in 1990 rather than 1980, and looking at the trend in median asking rents relative to median household incomes. And we see again that this affordability gap is growing. Meanwhile, we had this thing called the Great Recession. and it crushed millennials. It hurt everybody, I know. I know a lot of y'all are looking at me right now out of the side of your eye, probably thinking about your retirement portfolios, and you're saying, shut up about those millennials. Did I hear an amen somewhere? Okay. But let me talk a little bit about just how much this recession and its sluggish recovery really did impact them and what that means. Unemployment for 18 to 29-year-olds, your recent graduates, peaked at 18% in 2009. This was more than double the rate for all other ages. When you look back to 1990, 70% of those age 18 to 34 were working. Today, 63% of millennials are currently working. Okay, just another way of looking at that. In 2015, millennials accounted for 33% of the employed, but 48% of the unemployed. Average college-educated 18 to 34-year-old earned 36% less in 2013 than their counterpart prior to the onset of the recession. That is not a small amount. Okay, 36% less over that period of time in which housing prices still accelerated, right? That's the context. More graduated with debt. Student loan debt continues to rise. I mean, just pick a newspaper on any given day and there's an article about the student loan crisis in this country. It's immense, and it has really hit a crucial generation at a time when income growth is sluggish and at a time when our workforce needs them the most. The home ownership rate for millennials is down from 44% in 2004 to 36% in 2014. All of these other factors that I've talked about have obviously contributed to this. Now here's the one that some of y'all may not be so happy about. 1 in 3 millennials aged 18 to 34 are currently living with their parents. It's the first time in history that a plurality of 18 to 34-year-olds are living with their parents instead of some other living arrangement, be that single, cohabitation with a roommate, or married and cohabitating, right? Some of y'all may have seen this a couple weeks ago. Abodo, they are an apartment hunting website. See, a lot of data has been produced by Zillow, Trulia, other sites like this that deal with real estate in the last couple years. They did a survey of 2,000 millennials across the country earlier this year to find out what millennials really wanted in a city. They asked them to essentially evaluate what qualities are most important to them. Scale of 1 to 10, 10 being most important, 1 being the least. What you see here are the average ratings for just some of the factors that they mentioned. I did not include the line item about quality pizza. I'm not kidding. They asked them if pizza was an important decision-making factor, and the sad reality is that it came out higher than public schools. Jeez. But look at the top two. Look at 2 of the top 3 here, right? Affordable rent and affordable home prices are 2 of the 3 things that they say are most important to them, or that are their most desired features in a city. Affordability. That surprised me. It really did. I expected to see things like amenities much higher. I expected to see the restaurants, the revitalized downtown, the LGBTQ friendly, a little bit higher on here, and affordability a little bit lower. Now, they also asked to identify your perfect city. Okay, good. I got some laughter. So here we go. Put them together. I'm 34 going on 35, so that puts me like basically right in between these 2 generations, so that gives me the privilege of picking which one I want to say I'm in, and I get to choose based on my audience. So today I'm Gen X. This is ridiculous. But it shows that they want it all. They want the access to all these things, and they demand the affordability. Okay? But gosh, that is frustrating. So what are we left with in all this? Well, quite simply a battle for millennial talent. Communities and regions nationwide are competing for a limited pool of talent. The same way we've talked about competing for companies for so long, the narrative has changed. The work that we're doing in communities and regions today, we can't start the conversation about how do you retain your existing companies, how do you help startups thrive without talking about the issue of talent and without talking about the issue of place. This battle for talent, is going to dictate the future geography of jobs in this country. That's a reality. Okay, more so than anything else, the movement of people, speculatively, is going to dictate where jobs are going. The days of people following companies, I'm not going to say they're over, okay? But by and large, the script has been flipped. Companies are following people, okay? The narrative is different today than what it was even just maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So what are some of the implications? Well, remember this, okay? Younger people saying this is not where we want to live. It's a sad thing to face up to when you spent your life trying to make your community the best it can be. That's a tough, tough thing to look at if you're in rural and small town America. Remember this too. Some of us are moving closer and closer towards a community that is comprised largely of folks that are at the end of or done with their working years. Who's left, right? The Gen X and the Boomers. Not all of them. Certainly in many cities, there's plenty of evidence of your empty nesters moving back into the city, following the same trends, desiring the same things. But the backdrop to this is that, the baby boom generation is living longer. Our healthcare system keeps improving, and we keep extending life expectancy. As we talked about, retirement portfolios were hit tremendously by the Great Recession. The same way not all baby boomers are exiting rural and small town America, I don't want to leave you with the impression that all millennials, I'm sorry, let me rephrase, I said that wrong. The same way that I don't want to give you the impression that baby boomers are the only ones left in rural and small town America. I don't want to give you the impression that all millennials are not interested in rural and small town America. I think we do ourselves a disservice a lot of times by talking about millennials as if they're just one thing. They're just those smart young people that want transit in cities. And it's not the case. But overall, what you do see is that a greater portion of them relative to past generations have these preferences. So putting all this together, we've got a number of things we have to consider. First, accommodating an aging population. Okay, that means building age-friendly housing, building age-friendly communities. This is, down in the weeds, down in the details of making sidewalks handicap accessible and navigable, right? Making our housing navigable and accessible, and thinking about what kind of housing that we're creating. There are a number of resources out there from what's being done here in the state. I know the Aging Collaborative, the Massachusetts Healthy Aging Collaborative has a number of resources. WHO, AARP all have a number of resources to help communities think through how they can become the most age-friendly, not just in terms of their development patterns, but overall as a community. Accommodating an aging housing stock. Look, this is probably a more acute issue here than in many other parts of the country. The redevelopment needs, the redevelopment tools that you have accessible to you are absolutely going to dictate a great deal to how you accommodate these changing trends. Okay, in some cases, as people hollow out, the question is, what do we do with the housing that they left? Okay, yes, I know we need to build more housing in Massachusetts, but in some places we're going to have to ask a question what we do with some of this housing that's been vacated. How do we put it back into the highest and best use? Competing for the next generation, focusing on talent retention. Look, that means getting the stuff built as quick as possible, putting housing as close to the workforce as possible. I know that this is not some riveting new thing, but around the country, that is not commonplace. We don't generally put housing near jobs. And that's why we have congestion problems in regions that should not have congestion problems. The easiest way to reduce congestion is to put people next to the jobs. It's really, really simple. It doesn't cost billions of dollars building interstates and transit and tunnels. It doesn't take decades. Seems simple, right? We know it's not always that simple. Preparing for the next generation is really about encouraging you all to have these proactive conversations about where your community's headed, to look at these same indicators for your community and to think about what they mean for your community's direction. Okay, we very often plan based on the static data, based on where we've been. And we need to look at this information like the demographics, like the migration trends that foretell where we're going and how our community is going to change in order for us to make sure that we're providing the right housing stock. We spend a lot of time in our work with communities and regions trying to educate folks about this problem. The business community is starting to wake up to it, I think, around the country. They're starting to see that there are inhibitors to their ability to attract talent in their communities. And they're starting to take up policy positions that they have not historically taken up. And yes, this is not happening everywhere, but it's happening because they are motivated by the economic argument. And when I say the economic argument, I mean that which appeals to them. The fact that workforces are going to necessarily shrink if we don't provide the housing that they need, and that means jobs are going to decline. My company can't be competitive, right? That resonates with them. The story that we've been telling for a long time, I've turned it the social argument. I know that's probably not necessarily the right way to put it, but appealing on the basis that this is the right thing to do, that putting a roof over somebody's head, that making sure they can afford a roof over their head, that's the noble thing that we should all be striving towards, right, as communities, is making sure that everybody can have that most basic requirement of a roof over their head and can do so affordably. That appeals to people on a personal level. What I have seen is it doesn't appeal to the business community when it comes to building support for advocacy, for legislation, for policy positions that need to be advanced, because ultimately that's where we need their help. You got some acronyms up here. Some of y'all, I'm sure, are familiar with these. NIMBYs, right? Everybody knows NIMBY? Not in my backyard. Do you know banana? Yep. Build absolutely nothing, absolutely nowhere, anytime. And then the cavemen, citizens against virtually everything. Oh, they're not going away. But the reality is that a lot of those folks that are in those boardrooms and in those committee meetings that we're having, the stakeholders that are helping us shape a community's future, are those business leaders that have been your typical NIMBYs for a very long time. And they are putting aside their personal positions and their personal agendas because they recognize that this impacts their business. Okay? And that is, in my opinion, probably your path to appeal, to building potentially a new base of support, is appealing to that. We have for so long had this argument prevailed in the national discourse, and I don't know what it's like here, but it is all too prevalent across the Southeast, that this notion that multifamily development doesn't pay its way, right? Doesn't provide the fiscal returns that single-family development does. we've got to start finding a way to communicate to our constituents and to elected officials that there are negative fiscal consequences associated with not providing this housing. It's really easy to sit there and say, sure, here's the tax returns from this multifamily development and from this single family development in isolation, in a vacuum, fine. Are communities and economies and developments existing in a vacuum? No. That's part of the point here. If you don't build that housing, let's talk about all the foregone tax revenue. Okay? All the tax revenue that's not going to come because companies didn't come here, because we couldn't create a workforce that they needed. The companies that left, that are no longer paying those taxes because we couldn't provide the housing for them. That's the narrative we've got to start emphasizing, okay, is that it's the potential consequences. It's that potential negative fiscal impact of not taking action. Have the long view. Don't just be short-sighted and look at everything on a project-by-project basis. I know that's tough, okay, and I know that's how we evaluate things, but it's, you know, we've got to see that bigger picture sometimes. I'll leave you with a couple anecdotes on this. Do y'all have a app called, or a network called Nextdoor in Massachusetts? Is that set up yet? Okay, I see a couple people nodding their heads. If you're not familiar with it, get on it. I am one of these folks that is completely averse to social media. So that'll put me in the Gen X category and not the Millennial category. But the one bit of social media I join is a group called Nextdoor. And it's this great forum to facilitate dialogue within neighborhoods, and only within neighborhoods. The only people that can join are the people immediately proximate to you in your neighborhoods. About a month ago, there was a dialogue going on about a multifamily development that was proposed about 200 units, 3 blocks away from a single-family house that I own with my wife. Transit-oriented development around one of our 28 transit stations. Yay, Atlanta, we have 28 transit stations. And one of my neighbors was making a very serious argument. She truly believed that this multifamily development was not going to pay property tax. Okay? Renters, they're renting. They don't pay property taxes. So, yes, of course, multiple people flooded in to try to explain to her misunderstandings, but the reality is these are misperceptions. There's so much misinformation, and people have these long-held beliefs. And so part of our role, unfortunately, in being in this place is to constantly try to educate people. It's frustrating, it's difficult, and I know y'all are probably doing it on a daily basis, but it's important. The other anecdote I want to share from Atlanta is one that kind of ties a lot of these things together. Any of y'all heard of the Beltline? Atlanta Beltline is a Rails to Trails project, many of them around the country. I personally lament it in Atlanta because it was an idea conceived in 1996. And here we are, 20 years later, and what we have to show for it is 3 miles of paved trails. But the Atlanta Beltline is essentially a concept taking an old Norfolk Southern railway that creates a ring inside our interstate beltway loop that intersects our great plus sign of a transit system and connects many of the great neighborhoods of Atlanta. It's a fantastic vision that is truly transforming our city, but it's doing so all in a speculative way. Like I said before, only 3 miles of this trail system has been built. No transit has been put in place, but development is insane along the Beltline. Has anybody been to Atlanta recently and seen this firsthand? Okay, got a couple people in the back. In order to finance development of the Beltline, the city of Atlanta created a massive tax allocation district. That's what we call TIF, tax increment financing in Atlanta. Essentially, drew a district around the Beltline. Essentially, you freeze property taxes. Okay, in 2005, at a certain level, we collect all the increment associated with as taxes rise, and that tax increment pays off the bonds that we use to finance the development of the Beltline. Okay, so this was put into place right before the Great Recession, right? Really unfortunate. Tax values didn't grow as much as we would have hoped. But what happened was developers saw what was coming, okay? And they built like crazy around the Beltline. Fortunately, the Beltline was smart enough, the city of Atlanta was smart enough to make sure that that TAD had a inclusionary housing provision. Inclusionary housing, inclusionary zoning is not particularly popular in Georgia. Okay, so that was very much a big win. The city now is pushing a citywide inclusionary housing policy. But getting that 20% set aside was big. And so as all these developers came in and built all this multifamily housing around the Beltline, we made sure that we had some preserved for affordable housing. And what happened was Atlanta Public Schools was in the midst of a crisis at the time. Okay, there was a big cheating scandal that happened at APS, and APS lost a ton of revenue because they agreed to this deal with the Beltline to freeze property tax, right? And to have all the increment devoted to Beltline development. So the public school system was losing money, losing revenues at a time when they most needed it to revitalize the system. What's happening now is tons of commercial development is starting to follow all this housing. As people have flocked to the Beltline, those NCRs, all these other companies, Athena Health that I mentioned up there, so many of them are starting to populate around the portions of the Beltline where the housing has been built. The companies are moving to be near the people. Those companies are driving that property tax base up through the roof now. Okay? APS is really happy. Atlanta Public Schools these days. City of Atlanta, picture's looking a lot rosier. All right? So what's the takeaway? Look, an inclusionary housing policy, tax increment financing, multifamily development. It was an economic boom. Didn't seem so at the time, but it was. Surprise, surprise. Okay? Thank you all very much for listening, for humoring me as I geeked out a little bit on some data. I love this stuff. I hope you enjoyed it.